The fluorescent lights buzzed like angry insects. Sarah Chen didn't hear them anymore. 3 years of night shifts had taught her to filter out the ambient hum of Mercy General's ICU, the ventilators wheezing their mechanical rhythm, the monitors beeping in staggered patterns, the occasional call button chiming from rooms where patients couldn't sleep. She moved through the unit at 11:47 p.m. with the kind of efficient invisibility that made her nearly invisible to the attending physicians. Her badge hung from a lanyard, her scrubs were regulation navy blue, her shoes silent on the linoleum. She refilled coffee cups. She adjusted lines. She watched. Sarah had learned long ago that watching was safer than talking. The night shift stretched ahead of her like all the others, 12 hours of careful competence, of noticing things that needed fixing, of fixing them quietly before anyone asked. The ICU had 16 beds, and tonight 14 were occupied. Room 8 had a patient post-op from a spinal fusion, sedated and stable, breathing on his own. Room 11 held an elderly woman with sepsis, her daughter sleeping in the chair beside the bed. Room 4 had empty oxygen tanks and a patient whose nurse was chatting with the resident in the hallway instead of checking them. Sarah made a mental note. She would handle it in 5 minutes, after the resident left, so no one would notice. This was her pattern. This was her survival. She touched the unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, a habit so ingrained it didn't register as conscious anymore. Faded colors. Helmet insignia. The weight of it against her ribs felt like a prayer. She was 3 years into her routine of keeping her head down and her past buried where a 2-star general had ordered it to stay. That general had looked her in the eye in Helmand Province and said words that had never left her, Senior Chief Petty Officer Chen, you were never there. If you surface, people die. So Sarah Chen, the night shift nurse, worked quietly in a Houston ICU, and Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen existed only in the faded patch she touched 3 times every shift. She was charting in the break room when the call came through at midnight. New admission to room 12. Air Force Colonel, training accident, shrapnel lodged near the heart. Transferred from a regional facility where they couldn't handle cardiac trauma. ETA 5 minutes. Sarah's hand stilled on the keyboard. Her jaw tightened imperceptibly. She didn't move for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to breathe, to center, to bury whatever had just surfaced. Then she stood, smoothing her scrubs, and walked to room 12 to prepare the monitors and the bed. Her movements were precise, economical. Hand steady as surgical lasers. Blood pressure cuff positioned. Oxygen saturation probe clipped to the bedside stand. 12-lead EKG machine wheeled into position. For pumps tested and ready. She had learned these movements on a field hospital floor in Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province, where the lights never hummed because there were no lights, just handheld flashlights and the sound of incoming fire. This was easier. This was always easier now. The stretcher wheeled through the doors at 12:04. The colonel was conscious, pale, his breathing shallow. Sarah watched him the way a surgeon watches a patient, not with compassion, not yet, but with the focus of someone calculating time and consequence. His right side was bandaged heavily. Shrapnel from a training exercise gone wrong, the paramedic explained, compressed near the 5th and 6th ribs, proximity to the heart making extraction impossible in the field. He was stable for now. Vitals were adequate. But there was something in his appearance, the slight distension of his neck veins, the way his shoulder muscles were tense despite the pain medication, that made Sarah pause. She knew that look. She had seen it before, in field hospitals where the wounded arrived with injuries that seemed manageable until they suddenly weren't. Dr. Sterling arrived for the admission at 12:20. He was still in last night's clothes, the button-down expensive enough that Sarah noticed, the shoes the color of caramel leather. He took the chart from the paramedic without really looking at the patient, his eye scanning the transfer summary with the quick arrogance of someone who had already decided what the problem was and had no interest in being surprised by reality. He was 47. He had attended Harvard Medical School. He had 3 times as many publications as any other cardiologist at Mercy General, though Sarah had noticed that 2 of them had been retracted for data manipulation. His voice, when he spoke, carried the tenor of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in every room. "We'll monitor him overnight," Dr. Sterling said to the colonel without actually looking at him. "The shrapnel will need surgical extraction, but we have time. Your vitals are stable enough. Nurses will keep an eye on you." He handed the chart back to a resident, a young man with dark circles under his eyes whose name Sarah had never learned. The resident nodded with the enthusiasm of someone who had been taught that deference to hierarchy was more important than critical thinking. Dr. Sterling was already leaving, his shoes clicking against the linoleum in a rhythm that sounded like a timer counting down. Sarah moved to the bedside, her movements efficient and her voice low. "I'm going to do a full assessment now. Just some routine checks." The colonel nodded, grateful, and she began the process: blood pressure, temperature, oxygen saturation, the careful palpation of his abdomen to check for distension. His breathing was slightly labored, which made sense given the location of the injury. But there was something else. A subtle sign that most people would have missed, that Dr. Sterling definitely had missed because he had spent approximately 90 seconds with this patient before rendering judgment. The jugular vein in the colonel's neck was visibly distended. Not dramatically so, but noticeably. It should have gone down when he lay back slightly. It didn't. Sarah's mind moved through the differential diagnosis with the automaticity of someone who had been trained by necessity. Elevated central venous pressure. Possible pericardial involvement. Possible fluid accumulation around the heart from the trauma, even if the shrapnel wasn't currently penetrating the pericardium. Possible developing cardiac tamponade, though the colonel's blood pressure was still adequate. Not an emergency. Not yet. But a warning sign that something was changing in the mechanics of his heart, something that required constant attention, something that could deteriorate catastrophically if the right interventions weren't in place at the right time. She finished her assessment and documented everything precisely in the chart. Slightly distended JVD on exam. Heart sounds clear, but recommend monitoring for signs of pericardial effusion. Suggest echocardiogram to establish baseline cardiac function given proximity of injury to pericardium. She knew how these suggestions were received by Dr. Sterling. She had made them before, and they had been dismissed before, and she had learned to make them anyway because her responsibility to her patient superseded her concern about being perceived as overstepping. But she also knew the cost of being right too many times. Some doctors couldn't tolerate a nurse who saw things they had missed. The night deepened. 1 a.m. came and went. The monitors hummed their steady rhythms. Sarah checked on the colonel every 30 minutes, watching for any change in his breathing pattern, any shift in the tension of his neck veins, any subtle sign that his body was beginning the process of decompensation. His vitals remained stable. But stability wasn't the same as safety. She had learned that distinction in a place where people stabilized for 6 hours and then died without warning because infection had been spreading invisibly, or because the human body's capacity to compensate for trauma had limits that couldn't be predicted by any vital sign monitor. At 2:30 a.m., she was in the medication room refilling the pain medication pump when she heard Dr. Sterling's voice from the hallway, casual and certain, the shrapnel sitting there doing nothing. "We'll schedule extraction tomorrow afternoon once surgery clears their board. He's stable. He'll be fine. Just needs monitoring." He was talking to the resident, speaking with the absolute confidence of someone who had stopped considering the possibility that he might be wrong about anything. Sarah paused with the medication in her hand. She could feel the faded unit patch against her ribs, that weight of witness, that pressure of silence. The colonel's distended jugular veins had not changed. His blood pressure had remained consistent. But something in his presentation was shifting, something subtle and gathering, something that would become obvious in a few hours if she was right and catastrophic if she was, and nobody was prepared. She finished refilling the pump and returned to room 12. The colonel was awake, his eyes fixed on the ceiling in that particular way of hospital patients at 3 in the morning, not sleeping, not really alert, just waiting for dawn or pain or the next thing to happen. "How are you feeling?" Sarah asked, her voice the precise calibration of gentle without being deferential. "Any changes? Shortness of breath? Pain in your chest or shoulder?" The colonel turned his head slightly. Just tired. Waiting for surgery. He paused. You're good at this. You notice things. Sarah said nothing for a moment. Then, you need someone watching very carefully tonight. The surgical team will take good care of you tomorrow. She didn't say, I'm watching. She didn't say, I see what they missed. She didn't say, if your pericardium fills with blood, we have maybe minutes to fix it. She simply adjusted his pillow and left him with the monitors and the darkness and the knowledge that at least one person in this building understood exactly how fragile his situation was. What she didn't know yet was that Dr. Sterling had seen her competence as a threat, and he was already deciding how to neutralize it. He was already thinking about how to make sure that when the Colonel crashed, not if, because Dr. Sterling's arrogance had blinded him to the approaching reality, Sarah Chen would be alone and unsupported and vulnerable to every accusation he could manufacture. He didn't know her background. He didn't know what she had survived. He only knew that she had corrected his medication orders twice in the past 6 months, and that he was a man for whom being corrected by a nurse was an intolerable humiliation, and that he had the power to make her pay for it. The night shift continued. 3 a.m. 4 a.m. 5 a.m. The Colonel slept fitfully, his vital signs held steady by monitors and medication and the kind of luck that doesn't last forever. Sarah touched the unit patch one more time at 5:30 a.m., and somewhere in that gesture was the last moment of the relative peace she would experience for the next 72 hours. The morning shift change brought the conference room to a controlled simmer at 7:15 a.m. Dr. Sterling had summoned 5 doctors, Dr. Patel, Dr. Morrison, Dr. Kowalski, Dr. Hayes, and Dr. Nguyen, with the kind of urgency that made them drop their own rounds. He spread the Colonel's scans across the light box like a dealer laying down cards. The CT images glowed with clinical precision. Shrapnel fragment. Pericardial effusion. Moderate free fluid around the heart. All of it readable. All of it damning if he wanted it to be. The patient is too unstable, Dr. Sterling said, his voice carrying the flat authority of a man who had never been questioned in his own conference room. He moved his finger across the image. Pericardiocentesis is high risk. We manage conservatively. Fluids. Monitoring. We wait and see. The 5 doctors stood around the table like jurors who had already decided the verdict before testimony began. Dr. Patel, the cardiologist with 30 years of experience, opened his mouth. Sterling continued. The needle position is too dangerous with the fragment this close. 1 wrong millimeter and we puncture the right ventricle. Exsanguination. Dead on the table. His family sues this hospital for negligence. Dr. Morrison nodded. The others followed. No one asked about the patient's deteriorating jugular venous pressure. No one pulled up the echo results showing the fluid compressing the cardiac chambers. Sterling had built a consensus for a predetermined conclusion, and consensus, in hospital politics, moved like gravity. It pulled everything downward. By 9:30 a.m., Sarah was in the Colonel's room checking his oxygen saturation. The monitor showed 84%. Too low. His wife sat in the corner chair, her fingers knotted around a cold coffee cup. The woman's eyes were red-rimmed. Fear had made a home in that room, and fear smelled like stale air and disinfectant and the particular desperation of watching someone you love lose ground. Sarah touched the Colonel's wrist gently. His pulse was rapid. Thready. The kind of pulse that told her everything Dr. Sterling had decided to ignore. The door opened behind her. Dr. Sterling filled the doorway with the presence that made lesser people step aside. His voice, when he spoke, carried enough volume for the wife to hear every syllable as a weapon. Nurse Chen, I understand you've been making unauthorized medical recommendations to my patient. He didn't enter the room fully. He stayed in the threshold, blocking the exit. Blocking escape. Let me be clear on something. You are a nurse. You take orders. You do not diagnose. You do not prescribe treatment. You certainly do not contradict physicians in front of patients and families. His face had taken on the color of a man whose control was being questioned, and control, for men like Sterling, was survival. "This ends now." Sarah felt 500 eyes on her from every monitor in the room. The heart rate climbing. The blood pressure drifting. The machines all screaming their small mechanical screams while Sterling screamed louder. She had suggested only one thing, whispered it while adjusting the colonel's full line: pericardiocentesis is the only option left. A single sentence. A fact delivered as quietly as she could manage. Now it was being treated as insubordination. Now it was being treated as a war crime. One measured breath. Sarah's hand stayed steady on the colonel's wrist. Her eyes remained level. A single tear escaped, not from fear, but from the recognition of what was happening. The room watched. The wife watched. Sterling watched, waiting for the tremor, the crack, the moment when his power would finally break her. She didn't give it to him. "I've held beating hearts in my hands while people better than you bled out waiting for heroes who never came," Sarah said. Her voice didn't rise. Didn't shake. Just statement. Just fact. "I've done it in conditions you'll never see. With equipment you've never heard of. While incoming fire made the walls shake like cardboard." She looked directly at him. Not challenging. Not angry. Just seeing him. Really seeing him. "So no, Doctor. I'm not stepping back." Sterling's face went white-hot, then drained of color entirely. He spun and left without another word, his footsteps sharp against the tile like accusations. The wife stared at Sarah with something between gratitude and fresh terror. Sarah squeezed the colonel's wrist once and left the room, closing the door against the machines and the fear and the weight of having spoken truth to a man who measured his worth in the silence of people afraid to contradict him. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and defeat. Sarah sat down with her own cup at 9:57 a.m. 3 nurses were already there: Kim, Rachel, and Jennifer. They had worked the night shift with her. They had smiled at her during report. Now they grabbed their coffee cups and left the moment her chair touched the table. Conversation died mid-word. No one met her eyes. That was the worst part. Not the leaving. The practice non-acknowledgement. The way she became air. The way professions could decide collectively to pretend someone didn't exist. Sarah sat alone with her coffee and drank it cold. When she returned to the unit floor at 10:15 a.m., a formal write-up was pinned to the staff board in a plastic sleeve. Every nurse on the floor would see it during shift change. Every doctor walking past would see it. Mercy General operated on a principle that public shaming was more effective than private conversation. The document read, Nurse Sarah Chen, insubordination and unauthorized medical recommendations, final warning. The language was precise. Clinical. Damning. It wasn't an accusation. It was an announcement. Dr. Sterling stood in his office doorway, phone already in hand. His calls began before lunch. The first went to his brother-in-law, who sat on the hospital board and owed Sterling favors from medical school poker games and the occasional fishing trip down the Texas coast. The second call went to the state nursing board, voice measured and concerned about a dangerous pattern of autonomy from one of their licensed practitioners. The third call went to a private investigator Sterling had used before, a former cop named Holloway who specialized in background investigations and who asked no questions about why a doctor needed to know a nurse's history. By 12:30 p.m., Holloway was already digging. There was something in Sarah Chen's past that didn't add up. A 3-year employment history with a gap before it. References that checked out, but strangely. An address that changed frequently. These were the threads a man like Holloway could pull forever. The colonel's condition deteriorated through the afternoon shift like a tide going out and not coming back. His blood pressure dropped from 120 to 98. His jugular veins distended. His heart sounds became muffled, the distinctive finding that Sarah recognized as pericardial fluid compressing the chambers. Beck's triad building in real time. She documented every change in the medical record with the precision of someone building a case. Every number. Every observation. Evidence for a trial that might never happen. At 2 p.m., she approached Dr. Sterling at the nurse's station with the chart. Her voice was steady. Professional. Exactly what he wanted from her now that she had stepped out of line. Doctor, is showing Beck's triad. Elevated JVP. Muffled heart sounds. Blood pressure dropping. She kept the chart at her side, not offering it. Stating facts. He needs pericardiocentesis now. Dr. Sterling didn't look up from his computer screen. Your opinion is noted and disregarded, Nurse Chen. Continue monitoring. The dismissal was absolute. The power asymmetry was complete. She was a voice in the room he had decided not to hear. By 10 p.m. that night, during a routine check, the colonel suddenly gripped Sarah's wrist with surprising strength. His eyes had lost their fog. Something sharp and clear had moved through them, recognition. She was retaping his chest tube, that diagonal cross-wrap she had learned in a forward surgical team in Helmand Province, the one her hand still remembered after all these years. The stitch pattern was unmistakable. Military. Practiced. Learned under conditions that left their mark on muscle memory forever. You're a combat medic, he whispered, his voice thick but certain. Forward surgical team. I've seen that rap in theater. Sarah's face went carefully blank. The mask came down like a door closing. You're confused, sir. Rest. But he didn't let go of her wrist. His grip was weak but purposeful. Helmand Province. The question hung in the air between them. The knowledge of what she was, hidden under scrubs and night shifts and 3 years of keeping her head down. She gently removed his hand and left the room without answering. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall, her fingers finding the inside of her jacket where the faded unit patch was sewn into the lining. The patch from the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, a dark horse. The unit she had served within a place where heroes were the ones who came home and nobody asked questions about what they'd done to get there. In his office, Dr. Sterling was making his final call of the night. Holloway answered on the second ring. You were right, Holloway said. There's something. I'm not sure what yet. But there's a gap in 2012. Right before her first nursing job here. The records before that don't exist. Or they've been buried. Or both. Sterling smiled. This was the leverage he needed. This was the thread he could pull until everything unraveled. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't what was about to change everything. The evening shift had been a slow erosion. Sarah noticed it first in the colonel's neck, the jugular veins distending like cords pulled taut beneath his skin. His blood pressure, which had held steady at 118/76 during the afternoon, began its descent at 18:47 hours. 116/74. Then 110/70. Then 103/65. She documented each number in the chart with the precision of someone recording evidence, because that's what this was. Evidence that the constellation of symptoms forming around him spelled one specific catastrophe that Dr. Sterling had decided didn't exist yet. The colonel's breathing had changed too. Subtly at first, the way a ship's engines change pitch before a storm. Shallower. Faster. His lips had taken on a faint blue tinge that makeup couldn't hide and oxygen alone wouldn't fix. She'd seen this progression before, not in a textbook, not in a classroom simulation, but in a field hospital 30 kilometers south of Sanjin in Helmand Province where a British lieutenant had developed the same muffled heart sounds after shrapnel punctured the pericardium. The specific sequence. The specific timeline. The specific outcome if you didn't intervene. She checked his heart sounds at 2,115 hours. The distinct lub-dub that should have been crisp was muffled now, as if someone had placed cotton between the stethoscope earpieces and his chest. The medical term was muffled heart sounds. The human term was fluid accumulating around the heart muscle like water rising in a basement, pressure building, walls closing in. At 2,203 hours, his respiratory rate had climbed to 28 breaths per minute. At 2,301 hours, his blood pressure had dropped another 5 points. Each measurement was a sentence in a story that Dr. Sterling refused to read. Sarah pulled up the vital signs monitor and studied the waveform pattern with the intensity of someone reading a map in enemy territory. She calculated the pulse pressure manually, the difference between systolic and diastolic, the gap that told you something critical about what was happening inside the chest cavity. Normal pulse pressure was about 40 points. The Colonel's was narrowing. 38. 35. By 23:45 hours, it was 31. Widening pulse pressure could mean many things. Narrowing pulse pressure meant one specific thing: pericardial tamponade was beginning its acceleration. The heart was drowning inside its own sac. She documented everything. Times, measurements, observations, the clinical language of crisis unfolding in slow motion. The Colonel's wife had gone home at midnight after Sarah assured her he was stable, just resting. The medical team was monitoring closely. Sarah had wanted to call her back. She'd wanted to say, "Don't leave, don't sleep, don't believe us because we're all lying, because the man in that bed is running out of minutes and the only person in this hospital willing to say it out loud is a night shift nurse that everyone has decided to ignore." At 0015 hours, Dr. Sterling rounded. Sarah presented the vital signs trend with the flatness of someone reporting weather. Blood pressure trending down. Heart rate trending up. Respiratory distress increasing. Pulse pressure narrowing. The specific clinical language that meant exactly what it meant. Dr. Sterling glanced at the monitor for approximately 4 seconds. He didn't examine the patient. He didn't listen to the heart sounds. He didn't touch the Colonel's neck to feel the distended veins that were now visible even from the doorway. He simply said, "Continue current management. Call if there's any acute change," and left. Acute change. As if the acute change hadn't already begun 3 hours ago. As if the acute change wasn't written in numbers across the monitor screen and in the Colonel's increasingly desperate breathing and in the way his eyes were starting to move with the particular awareness of someone whose body was telling him something was very wrong. Sarah wanted to ask Dr. Sterling if he'd heard of the concept of prevention, of catching problems in their early stages before they became emergencies that killed people on your watch. She didn't ask. She watched him walk away and return to the bedside. The Colonel's eyes opened. They focused on her face with surprising clarity. His hand reached out and gripped her wrist with the strength of someone who'd just realized something terrible. "I can't breathe right," he whispered. Just that. Not a question. A statement of fact from a man whose body was speaking in the language of cardiology and whose brain was understanding the message even if the doctors weren't. "I can't feel right." "I know," Sarah said. Not a lie. Not false reassurance. Acknowledgement. "I'm watching you." His grip tightened. "Don't let me." The sentence didn't finish because his breathing accelerated and he released her wrist and his hand fell back to the bed. She adjusted his oxygen to 15 liters per minute, knowing it wouldn't help, knowing that the problem wasn't oxygen saturation, knowing that no amount of supplemental oxygen could fix a heart that was being compressed by fluid accumulation inside the pericardial sac. The equipment hissed as the oxygen flowed, a sound like air escaping from a punctured tire. At 0156 hours, his blood pressure was 98/52. His heart rate had climbed to 108. His respiratory rate was 31. The narrowing pulse pressure continued its downward drift. Sarah pulled the pericardiocentesis kit from the locked cabinet where emergency equipment was stored and placed it on the crash cart, not yet opened, not yet assembled, but positioned where it could be reached in seconds. Just in case. Just in preparation. Just because someone in this hospital needed to be ready even if that someone wasn't the doctor with the authority to make decisions. She sat at the bedside and watched the monitor display the Colonel's declining trajectory like a graph of a building being demolished in real time. The vital signs were telling a story. The body was sending signals. The science was absolute. And somewhere 3 floors down, Dr. Sterling was likely sleeping or drinking coffee in the physician's lounge, believing that a patient who was currently decompensating was stable because he decided it was stable, because his assessment, made without examination, made without listening, made without looking, was more real than the objective data accumulating on a screen. At 0203 hours, the colonel began to gasp. Not breath, gasp. The specific quality of breathing that meant severe distress, that meant the body was sending emergency signals to the brain, that meant time had just become a different kind of metric. Sarah's hand moved to the code button. Not yet. Not quite yet. 2 more minutes. At 0215 hours, his blood pressure was 87/41. His heart rate had climbed above 120. His skin was cool and clammy now, perspiration beading across his forehead despite the room temperature. His eyes were wide. His breathing was the sound of someone who was drowning while lying flat in a hospital bed, which was essentially what was happening, because fluid was filling the space around his heart and his heart was being compressed and his body was in crisis, and the crisis was exactly what Sarah had warned about 17 hours ago when 5 doctors had stood in a conference room and decided she was wrong. Sinus tachycardia. The monitor showed the characteristic pattern, a fast, regular heartbeat trying desperately to compensate for the decreasing cardiac output that came with the progressive tamponade. Each beat faster than the last. The electrical signal intact but the mechanical output failing. Classic presentation. Textbook deterioration. Exactly the progression that happened in the minutes before cardiac arrest when the pericardial sac became so full that the heart could no longer fill properly, could no longer pump, could no longer maintain the pressure necessary to keep blood flowing to the brain. Sarah's jaw clenched. Not from fear. From something colder than fear. From the specific clarity that came from having stood over a dead British officer in a field hospital while a major asked her why she hadn't done something faster, done something more, done something different. From having carried the weight of failure that came from having protocols and training and knowledge and still not being able to stop something bad from happening to someone in your care. At 0238 hours, his blood pressure was 76/38. His heart rate was 138. His respiratory rate was 35, which meant his body was in full distress mode, which meant the compensation mechanisms were failing, which meant the decompensation was accelerating now, which meant he had minutes, not hours. Sarah reached for the code button. And that's when the night shift resident, Dr. Patel, appeared in the doorway with a coffee cup in one hand and a concerned expression on his face. Behind him, visible through the corridor window, were 4 other doctors standing outside the glass: Morrison from cardiology, Kowalski from surgery, Hayes from critical care, Nguyen from internal medicine. 5 doctors. All of them present. None of them moving. The flatline alarm didn't scream. It wailed. That was the difference between theory and the thing happening 3 feet from your hands, and at 0303 hours, the monitor's shriek cut through Mercy General's ICU like something alive and wounded. Sarah's eyes had been on the colonel's chest when his rhythm collapsed, one moment a tachycardic but organized pattern, the next moment electrical chaos, the QRS complex dancing sideways like a drunk man learning to walk. Electrical alternans. The heart's last warning before it quit entirely. 5 doctors stood in the hallway outside the room. All of them present. None of them moving. We don't have consent, Dr. Sterling's voice carried through the open door, calm as a man discussing the weather. The family is terrified. The liability is astronomical. We wait for cardiothoracic to call back, or we don't touch him. He's crashing, Sarah said. She didn't shout it. The flatline was already doing the shouting. She stated it as fact, the way someone might say the sun was rising. Step back from the bed, Ms. Chen. Sterling's tone suggested she was a child reaching for a hot stove. Dr. Kovac has this. Dr. Kovac, a cardiologist who'd spent the last 6 hours deferring every decision upward, was still in the hallway. Still not moving. Sarah's hands were already moving. Muscle memory. The kind that survives classified operations and redacted files and orders never to surface again. Her body remembered Helmand Province better than her mind did, remembered the field hospital, the smell of diesel and copper and dust, remembered hands moving without permission from a brain that had been ordered to forget. She opened the pericardiocentesis kit. 14-gauge needle. Alligator clamp. Syringe. The equipment was sterile, arranged with the precision of a surgeon's intention. Sarah. One of the nurses, Morrison, who'd spent 3 hours pretending not to see her earlier, stepped forward. "Don't." The flat line continued its electronic scream. Sarah prepped the colonel's chest with betadine, the antiseptic smell cutting through the mechanical roar of the alarm. She identified the subxiphoid landmark, the notch where the rib cage ended, where the needle needed to travel at exactly 45 degrees toward the left shoulder. The anatomy was the same whether you were in a military hospital or a civilian one. The pericardium didn't care about credentials or consent forms or 5 doctors standing in a hallway with their arms crossed. "I'm calling security," Sterling said. Sarah inserted the needle. The sensation of resistance as the pericardium pushed back, that lived in her hands like a language she'd learned in a place that officially never happened. The colonel's wife had her face buried in her hands. His teenage daughter was crying without sound, the way people cried when they'd already accepted the worst. The needle slid deeper. The tip advanced through the pericardial sac. Sarah aspirated. 120 cubic centimeters of blood came back into the syringe. Dark. Catastrophic. The fluid that had been compressing the colonel's heart, crushing it with every beat until the muscle simply gave up. She withdrew the needle as the monitor's wail shifted, still alarming, still urgent, but changing shape. The rhythm on the screen flickered, steadied, and then the colonel's heart restarted with a shuddering kick against her gloved hand like something that had decided to live. Sinus rhythm. Organized. 68 beats per minute. The monitor's scream became a rhythmic beep, the sound of survival, and for 3 seconds nobody in the room breathed except the ventilator. Dr. Sterling's face was bone-white. The color of a man who'd just watched someone cross a line he'd drawn in permanent marker. He didn't speak to Sarah. He didn't even look at her. He turned and walked directly to his office. His movements were jerky, electric with rage in a way that made the fluorescent light seem to dim. 3 phone calls happened before dawn. Sarah didn't hear them, but she knew. The way you know where a predator is even when you can't see it, by the absence of smaller sounds, the held breath of the world waiting. The second call went to the state nursing board. The third went to someone who specialized in employee backgrounds, in unearthing the kind of information that hospitals preferred buried. By 0900 hours, 2 hospital administrators, men in suits that cost more than Sarah's car, walked to the ICU with security beside them and Sarah's badge already deactivated in one of their hands. "You'll need to come with us," the taller one said. Not a request. A statement delivered with the flat tone of people who'd given this speech before. Her locker took 90 seconds to empty. 3 weeks of 12-hour shifts had left her with a spare stethoscope, a jacket someone had lent her on shift 2, and a handwritten card from a patient's daughter thanking her for holding her father's hand during dialysis. She'd planned to throw that away. She didn't. The parking lot was blinding. Houston's sun at mid-morning had a weight to it, pressed down on everything. Sarah's scrubs were still damp from the night shift, sweat and blood and the particular humidity of an ICU where 6 people were still breathing because of machines. She sat in her car for 2 minutes before starting the engine. She didn't cry. Not then. Her daughter wouldn't understand if she came home with red eyes. Emma was 12, had homework, had a soccer game Saturday. Emma had a mother who worked nights and slept days and came home with stories about helping people. The lawyer's letter was already waiting on her passenger seat. Printed and placed by someone who'd known exactly when to deliver it. Gross insubordination. Unauthorized practice of medicine. A pattern of dangerous autonomy. They used the word pattern like it was a diagnosis, like her experience in places the government had ordered her to forget was something malignant that needed extraction. The drive home was 43 minutes. The morning light was so bright it was blinding, the kind of brightness that made her think of desert valleys and rotor wash and the voice of a 2-star general who'd looked at her across a briefing table at Bagram Air Base and said words that became law. Senior Chief Petty Officer Chen, you were never there, and if you surface, people die. Not metaphorically. Not as a threat wrapped in bureaucratic language. As objective fact, delivered by someone with the authority to make facts into reality. The kitchen table was cold against her forearms when she sat down at 1,400 hours. 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Hours that belonged to normal people doing normal things, the ones who got hired and fired during business hours, who had careers that followed rules, who didn't have classified memories locked behind security clearances that somehow still applied even after they'd quit. Her hands had stopped shaking by then. That happened around mile 25. The body learned to metabolize trauma the same way it learned to metabolize blood loss, slow, methodical, surrendering each component to the machine of survival. She was still in scrubs. Hadn't showered. Hadn't even changed. The antiseptic smell was baked into the fabric, and it smelled like the colonel's chest, like the moment before his heart restarted, like the moment she'd understood with absolute clarity that she couldn't stay silent and couldn't tell the truth, and there was no third option available to people like her. The shoulders started shaking first. Not sobs. She'd forgotten how to sob properly years ago. This was something quieter, something internal, the way an engine could shake itself apart if the governor failed. Her chin didn't tremble. Her face didn't crumple. But her shoulders shook with the kind of violence that came from holding something down so hard for so long that the thing being held finally demanded to be felt. The door opened at 1,427 hours. Soft sounds first, Emma's backpack hitting the hallway floor, her daughter's voice calling out in that particular tone of kids coming home from school, the one that expected everything to be exactly the same as it always was. "Mama." Emma appeared in the doorway to the kitchen. 12 years old, soccer cleats still on, dirt on one knee from practice, the kind of ordinary that made the world feel possible. Her voice was small, curious, the voice of someone who didn't yet understand that schedules breaking meant something had shattered. "Mama, why are you home when it's still light outside?" Sarah couldn't answer. Not because she didn't want to, but because the answer lived in classified files and redacted locations and the direct orders of people who had nuclear weapons and security clearances and the power to make mothers and daughters disappear if they asked the wrong questions. Emma waited 3 seconds. Then she dropped her backpack and walked to the table and sat down beside her mother in the afternoon light that was supposed to be impossible at this hour. The Chinook helicopter descended through Houston's evening haze like a dark prophecy made metal, its rotors hammering the air above Mercy General's rooftop helipad at exactly 1,700 hours. The rotor wash shook the windows on the 7th floor. Below, a 3-vehicle convoy blocked the ambulance bay, 2 Suburbans and a sedan with government plates, their doors opening in practice synchronization. Hospital security watched from the lobby but didn't move. They'd received the call 17 minutes earlier. Nobody said no to that voice. The Navy SEAL commander walked past security without breaking stride. His uniform was dress blues, not tactical, a deliberate choice that made him look more dangerous, not less. His presence moved through the hallway like a tank idling in an occupied garage, pressure changing the moment he entered a space. He walked past the administrator's office without knocking, past the conference room where lawyers in wool suits were drafting their liability statements, straight to the boardroom where 5 hospital executives and Dr. Richard Sterling sat around a mahogany table with a legal pad already half filled with recommendations for institutional damage control. The commander opened the door. He didn't ask permission. He didn't smile. "Where is Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen?" The room went dead silent. The CFO's pen stopped mid-sentence. The hospital administrator stood slowly, as if moving through water. Dr. Sterling's jaw clenched. Senior Chief. That wasn't a nickname. That wasn't a title a nurse carried. That was something else entirely, something that changed the chemical composition of the air in that room from certainty to ice. The commander didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked toward the waiting area, boots on tile, heel to toe, the sound of authority made audible. His aide followed with a sealed folder that looked old, classified stamps still visible on the edges despite the redaction markers. Sarah's daughter Emma stood from the waiting room chair the moment she saw them. She'd been sitting there for 3 hours, coloring in a notebook, waiting for her mother to explain why senior chief was a word that made adults move differently. The moment the uniforms appeared, she understood something fundamental about her mother had just shifted. Her voice cracked when she spoke, "Senior Chief." The commander looked at her with the careful attention a soldier reserves for family. He knelt slightly, not enough to be condescending, enough to meet her at her level. "Your mother's a hero, young lady. That's what we call people like her." In the boardroom, a trembling nurse administrator, her hands actually shaking, read from the classified file that the commander had placed on the table. Her voice wavered over each word, Navy Cross recipient. 17 classified operations. Trained in advanced trauma surgery under combat conditions. She paused. She had to pause. The words wouldn't come faster. 2 silver stars. The commander's voice was parade ground cold, each word a separate sentence. 3 bronze stars with valor. She is the only medic, not doctor, medic, to successfully perform a thoracotomy in a helicopter under enemy fire. He let that sentence hang. She saved my life. And 11 others. When command said we were already dead. Dr. Sterling's face drained white, not the white of surprise, but the white of a man watching his entire constructed world collapse at the microscopic level, the moment right before the foundation gives way. His hands moved to the desk, gripped the edge. The commander continued with the weight of a man who'd had to notify families. Senior Chief Chen carried 7 wounded personnel out of a collapsed field hospital in Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province, under active mortar fire. She performed emergency surgical interventions on 3 of them. 2 of those personnel are still alive because of her actions. That facility was classified. That operation was classified. Everything about Senior Chief Chen's service was classified, until one man decided his ego mattered more than her security clearance. Dr. Sterling stood. His chair scraped backward. He moved toward his office door like a man in a trance, like someone whose only remaining survival instinct was to move toward a computer and make evidence disappear before the next word was spoken. He didn't make it to his desk. Marcus Webb stood in the doorway, blocking the path. Marcus, the hospital's IT specialist. Marcus, who wore a simple polo shirt that nobody noticed was perfectly pressed. Marcus, who kept his hair regulation short and his eyes surveillance sharp. Marcus, who had spent for years as a combat engineer with the 75th Ranger Regiment and still knew how to secure a perimeter. He held 3 USB drives in his left hand like they were grenades with the pins pulled. "Looking for these, Doctor?" Marcus's voice had the texture of sandpaper dragging across steel. "I copied every frame to separate drives. 12 hours ago. Every hallway camera. Every conference room. Every moment you spent reviewing footage of yourself standing motionless while a patient flatlined." Marcus stepped closer. Dr. Sterling stepped back. "I also found your deleted emails to that private investigator. Your calls to the state medical board. Your text messages to your brother-in-law about burying this incident." Marcus held up one drive. Then the second. Then the third. "I filed a report with the state medical board 2 hours ago. Documented everything. An attending physician who deliberately prevented life-saving treatment. Falsified performance reviews. Weaponized institutional authority to cover clinical incompetence." Marcus's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I also preserved the security footage from the code blue at 0303 hours. Shows 5 doctors in the hallway. Showing nothing. Doing nothing. Shows 1 nurse performing an emergency procedure that saved a patient's life." Dr. Sterling's brother-in-law stood from the table. He didn't look at Sterling. He looked at the lawyer beside him, the hospital's lawyer, not his. "Richard, I can't. I have a fiduciary duty to this institution." The words landed like a door closing. The hospital administrator gestured to security, who were already standing in the hallway. "Your badge, please. And your prescription pad." "You can't do this," Sterling's voice cracked. Actually cracked, like a teenager's. That nurse violated protocol. She performed a procedure she wasn't qualified for. She exceeded her scope. She saved a man's life, the commander said quietly. Under combat conditions, we call that leadership. Under civilian medicine, apparently you call it insubordination. The colonel's wife emerged from the hallway with her phone in her hand, screen already dark from recording. My husband is alive because that nurse defied you. Because she trusted her training over your authority. I'm going to make sure everyone knows it. By evening, Dr. Sterling's credentials were suspended pending a formal investigation. By the next morning, every hospital network in Texas had flagged his file. The private investigator he'd hired, the one Marcus Webb had connected to a separate case involving insurance fraud, cut a deal with the state and testified against him to avoid his own charges. The state medical board received Marcus's security footage at the same time they received the complaint about deliberate non-intervention. The footage showed exactly what Marcus said it would show: 5 doctors frozen in a hallway while a patient died. And one nurse whose hands moved with the absolute precision of muscle memory from a place and a time the hospital administrators would never fully understand. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the Mercy General courtyard wearing her navy dress blues. The ceremony had filled with medical staff, nursing school students, colleagues who'd whispered about her dismissal and now understood. The colonel stood beside her in his dress uniform, fully recovered, the scar tissue on his chest already fading into the kind of quiet history that only he and Sarah would ever really comprehend. His wife held their daughter's hand. Emma wore a dress, and for the first time since her mother came home at 2 in the afternoon, she understood why. Sarah's dress blues hung perfectly on her frame. But what caught everyone's attention was her right shoulder, the faded unit patch from Helmand Province, the one she'd kept sewn inside her jacket lining all these years, touching it like a talisman through every shift, every insult, every moment of silence. The patch was finally where it belonged. In public. In the light. On her uniform for anyone to see. The hospital had offered her the Director of Trauma Services position that morning. The SEAL commander presented her with a shadow box containing her Navy Cross, finally public after years of classification. Sarah accepted it without ceremony. She'd learned long ago that heroism didn't require fanfare. It required the ability to make the right choice when nobody was watching and knowing you'd made the right choice when everyone was. The commander raised his glass to Senior Chief Chen. Who taught us that not all heroes wear capes? Some wear scrubs. Across town, in a gymnasium that smelled like rubber mats and industrial disinfectant, Dr. Richard Sterling set up a CPR dummy for a basic certification course. He made $12 an hour. He taught people who didn't know his name used to carry weight. His medical license was permanently revoked. His brother-in-law had changed his phone number. The private investigator who'd worked for him was serving 18 months in federal prison. The lawsuit his malpractice insurance wouldn't cover had cost him everything except the ability to teach room temperature compressions to students who saw him as just another instructor with graying hair and calloused hands from a different kind of work. Sarah stood in the courtyard as the ceremony ended, watching the colonel shake hands with the staff who'd believed in him when the system tried to abandon him. Her daughter held her hand. The patch on her shoulder caught the evening light, faded but real, a piece of who she was that nobody could bury again. The chaplain approached and placed a hand on her shoulder, the patched one. "Welcome home, Senior Chief." Sarah nodded. She didn't say much. She'd learned that the quietest voice in the room is often the one holding everything together. She watched the colonel laugh with his wife. She watched her daughter understand, finally, why her mother had made the choice she had. She watched the evening light settle across the hospital courtyard like a benediction, and she felt the weight of the truth: the system didn't protect people. People protected people. Nurses protected people. And sometimes, it took a helicopter landing at 1,700 hours for anyone to notice. If you believe in speaking truth to power, subscribe. If you believe nurses deserve recognition for the lives they save in the dark, like this video. And comment, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your history? Let's talk about it.